You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Welcome back to Business of Drinks. I'm Erica Ducey.
And I'm Scott Rosenbaum. Today we're speaking with Chris Watt, CEO of Branca USA.
Branca is the North American arm of Fratelli Branca Distillery, the legendary Milan-based company behind iconic brands like Fernet-Branca, Carpano Antica, and Borghetti. Branca's history goes back 180 years, but this is a story about modern reinvention. Since launching its U.S. subsidiary in 2019 and bringing Chris on as CEO in 2022, Branca USA has been on a tear.
They are now selling more than 3 million bottles a year in the United States, and the momentum keeps building. According to Nielsen, the company is up 8% in both volume and value this year, a growth rate that is outpacing the entire spirits category.
Yeah, and a lot of that growth is coming from smart, highly focused strategies. Chris and his lean team, which is just 48 people across the country, they've driven major gains with 4 key moves. First, doubling down on Fernet-Branca as the go-to shot and beer order in college towns and neighborhood bars. Next, repositioning Borghetti as the easiest way to make an espresso martini. It's now the fastest growing coffee liqueur in the US, up 81% in volume this year, according to Nielsen. Also, turning Carpano Antica from a bartender's secret into a home bar essential. And last, creating super smart distributor-friendly partnerships. Like, for example, teaming up Borghetti with Tito's or Deep Eddy for espresso martini promotions, depending on which brand the distributors carry, to make it a win-win for the distributor every time.
I absolutely love the thinking here, right? You've listed the priorities in less than a minute or so. And when you do that, it allows employees and founders, distributors, and brand partners to really focus on what matters. It's really a smart way to create these win-win situations for the brand and its distributors. And the team at Branca USA is incredibly data-driven as well.
Yeah, absolutely. They're using data to make decisions on where and when to launch and building campaigns with measurable return, like the once you know Fairnet push, which you'll hear about, and those eye-catching total wine displays.
Plus, they are tapping into cultural relevance in a big way. We're talking using TikTok influencer partnerships, really doubling down on espresso martini at Vespa bars, March Madness tie-ins. This is all part of their mix.
So, whether you're building a brand, managing a portfolio, or trying to win in retail and on premise, this is an episode with serious playbook value. So, with that, let's get into it. Our conversation with Chris Watt, CEO of Branca USA. And now, a word from our sponsor. Is your drinks brand looking to start or expand import and distribution?
Whether you're seeking to enter new markets or you're unhappy with a current distributor and desiring a better fit, you should know about Swig Partners.
Founded by industry experts Eric Siegelbaum and Amy Troutmiller, Swig takes the guesswork and the legwork out of distribution strategy. Swig helps brands and distributors find the right fit for long-term relationships and sales success.
US-based importers and distributors should reach out too. With Swig, they can explore new products for free. And brands, you can get $100 off by mentioning Business of Drinks. Find out more at swigpartners.com/business of drinks. That's swigpartners.com/business of drinks.
Chris, thanks so much for coming on the Business of Drinks.
Thank you for having me, Erica. Big fan of the show and delighted to be your guest today.
Awesome. So, tell me about your background and how you ended up running a beverage alcohol company.
Yeah, so I'd come back to the UK from university in Montreal in 2009, and I had applied for a summer internship at Mackay, the Scotch company. That turned into a full time position. But honestly, that was always supposed to be a pit stop. The kind of idea was to get down to London and join the advertising industry. But I fell in love with the Scotch whiskey industry, and I ended up staying at Mackay for 13 years, doing a bunch of roles on the global brand side, and then a number of roles on the executive side in the US, Canada, and Latin America. And then I guess it was sometime in the fall of 2021 when a mutual friend of mine introduced me to the Branca family. And those conversations eventually led to me joining Branca USA as the CEO in mid 2022.
Amazing. And so, my understanding is that Branca USA was founded in 2019 as the American subsidiary of Fratelli Branca Distillery, which is a Milan based company with a history that dates back to 1845. So, what was the rationale behind creating this new division?
Sure. I think the family realized that the potential for growth in the US market was massive. And taking control of the importation of the brands, dealing directly with the distributor and the customer, that's a necessary investment in terms of trying to realize that full potential. And I will say the Brancas have had a pretty solid history and track record of opening subsidiaries across the world. If you look at our business in Argentina, it's a 6 million case brand in Fernet-Branca. So I think they realized that if you're going to play to win in a competitive marketplace, you have to be in control. And so far, that's kind of shown to be true. Branca USA calendar year to date in Nielsen is one of the fastest growing, in fact, the fastest growing spirit supplier of the major players. That's also true on the last 52-week read. And, if we hadn't opened our own shop, I'm not sure that the brands would be having the success that they are today.
Yeah, absolutely. That leads me to a question because
Hmm.
the brands are showing a lot of growth right now. And I think this portfolio is a really interesting sort of study about balancing tradition and innovation.
Mhm.
There's such storied brands, and we know that the consumer landscape is really shifting very quickly. So, how do you, as a leader for the portfolio, think about maintaining relevance and shifting with consumers?
Yeah, to your point, I mean, we are celebrating our 180th anniversary this year. So the brands and the business has been around for quite some time. But the vision for our business in the United States, for Branca USA, is to build brands that stand the test of time. And that requires brand reinvigoration. In some cases, it requires brand reinvention, whether that's new drink strategies, new packaging designs, new campaigns. And I think, one brand that we've done a really phenomenal job on is Borghetti, our espresso liqueur. When I joined the business in 2022, that brand was about 7,000 cases. If you look at it today on a rolling 12, it's about 52,000 9-liter cases. So that's had exceptional growth. And that was a brand that required really the kind of full treatment, inclusive of packaging, where we were able to turn that around very, very quickly with a new design and get it into market within about 6 months, and complete with a campaign that really speaks to the new generation of legal drinking age consumers, right? The folks that are learning how to make cocktails on TikTok. And that's really what we leaned into with Borghetti to create that success. Another example is Fernet-Branca. When I came into the business, Fernet hadn't really grown under Branca USA. So we had to diagnose what was going on, what were the issues. And there was a couple of points that became apparent quite early. Number one, we didn't have the right distribution. We had a lot of distribution in the United States, but the proposition of the brand was really kind of shot in beer. And fundamentally, 70% of our distribution in on-premise was in dining. And, not a lot of consumers are doing Boilermakers after dinner. So we had to shift our distribution focus to driving our penetration within neighborhood bar, within sports bars, and really focused on areas outside of the major metro hubs, focusing on university towns and such. That was tremendously successful to getting our drink strategy into the accounts that could actually drive volume. And then the second point with Fernet was, when I came into the business, the brand had been very successfully built by the bartender. It is the bartender's handshake. It's a trade darling. And ultimately, the business was still 100% focused on the trade. Very little attention had been given to the consumer. And, my background is mostly marketing. So we built a brief based on the data work that we had done and came up with a campaign called Once You Know, You Know, which was really threading the needle between the bartender and the consumer that we wanted to attract. And that was successful. We did it very carefully, and we never took the bartender out of our kind of design target. That's the consumer archetype that built the brand to where it was. But, you fast forward from 2022 to 2025, we've had 2 total wine wow displays with Fernet-Branca right at the front of the store. And that was kind of unimaginable in 2022 when I came into the business. So, a lot has changed during that period of time. And definitely, the brands are just as good as they were. All we've tried to do is, tweak the strategy to make them more applicable to a wider target audience.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I love that concept of like once you know, because it's like really sort of like creating that FOMO for consumers to be like, wait, like bartenders, like they're in the know, and like, how can I be in the know? That's so fun. And I'm thinking also about Carpano vermouth. So I remember it being a big deal for bartenders when Carpano Antica became widely available. And so how have you approached building a following for that brand in the US?
Well, I'd love to say there was some sort of genius marketing idea behind Antica Formula or some sort of campaign that transformed the brand into what it is today. But quite frankly, that was organic. The interesting thing about the vermouth category before Carpano Antica Formula really came onto the scene was that it was really dominated by Martini and Rossi, which is a fantastic brand, but ultimately the liquid quality of Antica Formula is just so superior to anything else out in the marketplace that, as that brand came into the United States, bartenders immediately lapped onto it and really built the brand to what it is today. We have a significant national accounts business on Carpano Antica Formula. And, if you go into any reputable mixology account or fine dining account across the country, typically that's what they're going to pour. And, what we also found, and this was something that, I think was really one of the key strategic moves that we made in the last 3 years, was partnering with other brands in other suppliers to drive drink strategies for consumers. So we partnered with Brand Foreman, for example, for the perfect formula for the perfect Manhattan with Woodford Reserve. And that started to bring Antica Formula to, end caps and major chain retailers across the country, or window displays in New York. And, as folks kind of particularly coming out of the pandemic realized that, oh, wow, there is ways to really enhance my cocktail at home, that has also helped drive Antica Formula to the forefront of people's drinks carts and ensuring that, that's the standard bearer of sweet vermouth that they need to have in their fridge at all times.
Yeah, I definitely am a little troubled when I go to a bar and there is not Antica Formula for
I,
my
I
Manhattan,
share
I will
that
say.
concern. I share that concern.
At that point, I'm like, yeah, maybe I'll just have a beer. I don't know. But you mentioned you touched a little on Cafe Borghetti, and looking at Nielsen, it's the fastest growing coffee liqueur in the U.S. This year, year to date, 81% up in volume, 84% up in value, which is just astounding founding. And I know you mentioned the, kind of the refresh and, reaching the new audiences. I'm like curious to understand more about what strategies specifically are working to build that audience.
Sure. I think with Borghetti, it's really about our singular focus on the espresso martini. There are great coffee liqueurs out in the market. The beauty with Borghetti is that it's made in Italy with real espresso, and you really can make the perfect espresso martini with two ingredients. And I think when you look at the success of the brand and just even the national accounts that it has ended up in, like, for example, Cheesecake Factory. They sell a lot of cheesecake, but they also pour a lot of espresso martinis. So I think ultimately in on-premise, the brand was very successful, driven by the ease of use and the quality of the liquid. And that's very consistent with all the brands that we have at Branca. The liquid quality is second to none. And then I think from a consumer standpoint and the success that we're seeing in the retail channel, that's really driven by the approach that we took to engaging the consumer. We didn't go out and build a traditional campaign. We focused on, social media like TikTok and how we can go out and really build influencer campaigns so that, as new consumers coming into the brand are looking for, how do I make a perfect espresso martini? Borghetti shows up. We partnered with a couple of influencers who have a reach of about 10 million between Instagram and TikTok, called Carlo and Sarah, who have a nice kind of Italian-American backstory. And that's been hugely successful to just bring the brand to new audiences. And, certainly the consumer pull that we've seen at the retail channel has even shocked us. So we're very grateful and excited to see what that brand does in the future.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the customers, like
Mhm.
broadly. For Branca, for the whole portfolio, do you find that the audiences and like the sort of demographics and lifestyle, psychographics represented by those audiences, do they really vary by brand, or is the kind of, are they more streamlined so that you are really trying to target very specific types of customers like across the portfolio?
They totally vary. So, I refer to particularly Antica Formula and Fernet-Branca as being two sides of the same coin as it relates to our portfolio. So, Antica Formula, it's a, ultra premium vermouth, and ultimately is kind of, the standard bearer for a Negroni or for a Manhattan. And those are typically being sold in higher end on-premise accounts. So whether that's fine dining or polished casual or luxury lodging. So, if you were to map our business by zip code, you would see Antica Formula over-index in markets like, Metro New York or Los Angeles or Miami. Fernet is quite different, actually. And, it's interesting. One of the first things that myself and my team did when we came into the role was really try and understand who the Fernet-Branca consumer was, right? We knew the bartender was certainly the main driver of the growth, but, I had to believe that there was an underlying trend that existed. And ultimately what we found was the brand organically over-indexed in markets where there was universities in close proximity. And, if you look at a market like Washington, for example, right, one would assume that your top accounts by volume in on-premise would be in Seattle, right, driven by bartender culture, et cetera. They're actually in Spokane. They're literally kind of within walking distance of the university in that town. That's the same in Indiana as well, right? Evansville, for example. So Fernet's a really interesting brand in that, yes, it has the bartender support, but ultimately there's kind of organic consumption that's taking place in some of these college towns. So that's a little different in how we've gone to market, because really where we look to concentrate and break through with Fernet-Branca is in neighborhood bars and sports bars, where that kind of shot and beer consumption occasion is taking place. Very different for Antica Formula. Borghetti kind of crosses both lands in that, With Borghetti, you definitely have more application just on the basis that the espresso martini is so popular right now. And again, because of the liquid and the fact that you really can make an espresso martini with just vodka and Borghetti, that plays well in a dive bar that has a couple of cocktails on the list. So the consumers are very different. The bar universities are very different. The drink strategies are very different, but somehow they're all interconnected in some strange way, which seems to work for us. And our distributor has really kind of understood that and is going to market quite successfully in building all three successfully at the same time, which doesn't always happen, as we know, in the drinks industry.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's dig into that a little bit because, Branca USA is now selling more than 3 million bottles a
Mhm.
year in the US and was up single digits in volume and value last year. And this year is up really strong, up 8% in both volume and value in Nielsen tracked channels. Given market conditions, that's sort of astounding. So, I know that you think about it like in terms of individual brands, but when you are looking at driving growth across the portfolio, like how do you conceptualize that? Like what are you thinking and planning and strategizing to engineer growth across several different brands?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing that we really did in 2022 and the early part of 2023 was reposition Branca USA with our distributor partners and provide them with clear priorities and clear commercial roadmaps for growth. So we had very simple priorities that haven't changed in 3 years. The first one was building a bitter shop brand of scale with Fernet-Branca. The second one was winning the espresso martini moment with Borghetti. And then finally owning the premium vermouth opportunity with Carpano. And what we also presented to our partners was the opportunity for them to basically own the other half of the cocktail, right? Distributors in many cases, have the vodka or the tequila or whatever it may be, but oftentimes they don't ask for the vermouth or they don't ask for the coffee liqueur. And that was a kind of change that we brought to our strategy. And ultimately, it started to create this opportunity to partner with other brands in our competitors. So, for example, we partner with Tito's, we partner with Deep Eddy as it relates to the espresso martini with Borghetti. I mentioned earlier, we partnered with Woodford Reserve and we've partnered with Four Roses and others. And that's been very successful for us because it's allowed our distributors to kind of kill two birds with one stone. And ultimately, for the consumer and for the customer, deliver a drink strategy which is going to create a great cocktail, right? Whether that's in the on premise or whether the consumer is making it at home. So we've called this, in some of our materials, Branca's pilot fish strategy, where our brands swim with the sharks, even though the
Yeah.
sharks are, owned by our competitors. And that's been very successful for us as a business and has also been successful for the partners that we've worked with. And then I think the final point is just this idea about, trying not to peanut butter spread investment. I listened to your interview with Elwin, and he was saying, we treat the U.S. like it's Europe, right? Every state's a different country. We do exactly the same thing. Maybe that's a British thing, but ultimately, we've been able to create these strategies to concentrate and break through in particular markets, in particular states, which are differentiated. And that, I think, is, again, one of the reasons why we've been able to develop the portfolio simultaneously without having to just focus on one particular brand or one particular strategy.
That's fascinating. I'm curious to hear more about that differentiated strategy. So, what does that look like? And then also, I'm just curious, like, are you working with one distributor or many distributors, and are all of the products available in all of the states?
Sure. Yeah. Well, all of our brands are available in all 50 states, but obviously we have certain states that we, are better equipped to go out and win based on our distributor, based on our people that we have in market. So from that standpoint, we are nationally available. But we have, 20 states that do 80% of the business, right? Which is typically how it works. In terms of our distributor network, we're actually partnered with pretty much all of the big guys. RNDC, Southern Wine Glazers in certain markets, Breakthrough in certain markets, Empire Merchants in New York, Martinetti, and such in the kind of Northeast. So, we have a very basket of distributor partners, which, definitely presents its challenges, but certainly also presents its opportunities because we're not focused on exactly the same brands in every single marketplace, right? There might be one market where we're trying to concentrate and break through on Antica formula, and really that takes the majority of our time. Whereas in another market across the street, it might be very much focused on Fernet-Branca and Borghetti. So we have a varied approach. The other thing which is kind of interesting about Branca, which I didn't actually fully understand before I got in the chair, is that we are actually a wine and spirits company because vermouth is wine. So in certain states, we have distributors that are focused on our spirits portfolio and certain distributors focused on our vermouth portfolio. So, it's an interesting kind of route to market that we have across the US.
That is fascinating. And what does the channel mix look like? I know that on premise definitely has helped build these brands in the US market, but how does it play out now in terms of like percentages?
Well, ultimately, during COVID, you obviously saw, the business lose a lot of the on-premise share, and that moved over to off-premise. Since then, we've kind of moved it back, but we're almost a perfect 50-50 split
Wow.
across the portfolio. Borghetti still leans a little heavier towards on-premise, but generally speaking, we're 50-50. And we're very blessed that both of those channels are growing, which isn't the case, obviously, for the majority of the industry. So from that standpoint, we're very focused on building the brand with the consumer at retail, either delivering drink solutions that allow them to make the best possible cocktail at home, or in the case of Fernet, create an opportunity to create a higher energy moment, before heading out or whatever it might be. And then in the on premise, it's really about delivering those best in class ingredients to make the perfect Manhattan, the perfect Negroni, the perfect espresso martini. And then obviously, Fernet-Branca does what it says on the tin as it relates to, what that means for the on premise and the bartender. So that's our approach.
Fascinating. All right, so I'm curious to know, since we've been talking about like portfolio versus brands, how do you approach marketing for the portfolio? Do the brands have separate resources or shared resources in terms of their marketing organizations?
Yeah, we have a very lean organization and a very, very lean marketing organization. Typically, the approach that we take, first of all, we try and understand who the consumer is, how they're consuming the brand, where they're consuming the brand. That's the first thing that we do. And that starts with our strategic analytics team, right? They're looking at the data. And that's our kind of our stick, right? We're a data orientated company. The second piece then is looking at all of our markets and trying to understand where can we concentrate and break through successfully. Where do we have the resources to win? Again, to my earlier point, not trying to peanut butter spread our dollars across multiple markets and multiple ideas. And then the third piece is then taking all of that and then writing a brief which is going to work. And I found that pretty consistently throughout my career in the spirits industry. If the inputs to the brief are good and the creative agency or PR agency, whatever it might be that you're working with, are good, the results are going to be pretty good. And that's kind of where we've had a lot of success over the last few years, particularly as we kind of pivoted from just being trade focused to also taking a firm view on the consumer and trying to drive our penetration within that group.
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear more about that data organization
Yeah.
because we talk a lot about data on Business of Drinks and the dearth in many parts of the industry, but also the importance of getting good data. So, tell me about your data organization and then about the company organization in general. You mentioned it was pretty lean. Like, how many people are we talking about and sort of what capacities?
Sure. So I mentioned this to somebody the other day, and they almost fell off their chair based on the size of our business. So we only actually have 48 people within our organization. We have 13 in HQ. We have about 35 out in the field. So we're small in the context of our total overhead. But I think my philosophy as it relates to building teams, and this has been based on experience and great counsel from mentors in the industry. Don't worry so much about having the most people, worry a lot about having the best people. And we have really spent the last 3 years, I think, building one of the best in class organizations for a business of our size in the industry. And of course, people make brands, right? It doesn't happen by osmosis. So a lot of the results that you've spoke to are driven by the hard work of the team, whether it's ops, marketing, or commercial. But ultimately, that's the kind of shape of the organization. Relating to your point around data, so in my career when I was working at Mackay, during that period of time, we were the business was imported by E&J Gallo. So I had spent a lot of time working with the Gallo organization, working with Ernest specifically when he was in the role of general manager of spirits. And, I just soaked that whole experience up like a sponge. And as from speaking with Britt and others, they're a data organization and they do it very, very well. So I took the learnings from that and applied it to Branca. And I think ultimately, what's interesting about the business in the United States versus the business in Europe is that you really do have full visibility to your account level data in America. You don't have that in Europe. So once you try and figure out what to do with it, that kind of unlocks this potential for growth and market share that is, in my mind, again, one of the key drivers of our success in the United States. So we built a very small organization focused on data mining and building, best in class reporting, but really more than anything, analytics that drive breakthrough insight. And data, as I mentioned, really is the kind of engine of the whole organization. So we're very focused on looking at data before we write a creative brief. We're very focused on looking at data before we engage with our distributor, and I think that has been important for us in order to kind of move from, being a supplier that had a number of brands but was really known for Fernet to a supplier which is now, I think, starting to be seen as a portfolio player that can add extreme value to distributors and customers, right? Based again on, I think, some of the work that we've been able to get done with our chain customers and national account customers, which again, has driven a lot of the growth that we've seen across the last 3 years.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the results speak for themselves, like that's just the key with data is it can lead to so many unlocks. So, okay, we've talked about the big wins here. What is the biggest challenge that you've faced as CEO since taking the reins?
Well, there's certainly a few challenges at the moment as it relates to trade and all the stuff that's happening within the distributor tier. But that aside, I think the biggest challenge that I faced was speed to market, right? And being able to get the kind of strategy from, the PowerPoint deck into the world and executing, because we didn't have a huge amount of time to get that done. So I remember the first 6 months, with the small team that I had, I think for those guys, they felt like they joined the military because we were in the office kind of 7 days a week and we kind of lived, breathed, ate Branca. But it was a lot of fun. And I think for those folks, all of which are still in the organization, they're not kind of reaping the rewards of that, right? Because, that initial work and thinking has turned into the results that you spoke to. So from that standpoint, I think that's been a pretty rewarding experience for the organization. It has kind of built the culture that we have and that kind of team spirit that we have as an organization. So yeah, I think that's the kind of best way to answer that question.
Yeah. All right. So back to the nitty gritty. So, I was curious to hear a little bit about education, like consumer education, because These brands are so storied, and how do you educate American consumers about traditional Italian spirits and vermouths and their place in modern mixology and history and wine culture? Like, do you have an approach that you found works?
We do, and it's been a kind of test and learn model. We just actually launched something called the Carpano Vermouth Academy, and that's an online training platform that we've integrated into all of our distributor LMS platforms and that we're pushing out to the trade. Very focused on, what is vermouth, educating the trade on vermouth. We will eventually transition that towards the consumer as well, because as we know, the United States doesn't have the same history with vermouth as you might see in Italy or Spain. And ultimately, I think for those folks that have had an Antica Formula Manhattan versus, another, the Antica Formula Manhattan might be the one that they prefer. So that's definitely the next phase for us as we try and bring more of vermouth education to the off-premise and to the consumer. And as it relates to Fernet-Branca, Fernet-Branca is an extremely complex liquid. 27 herbs and spices. The process to make it is beyond complicated. And I think that's one of the reasons why, the brand is so polarizing, right? It's the Marmite of Amaro. You either love it or you hate it, but you'll always remember it. And whilst we have a ton of education on Fernet, we have incredible ambassadors in Italy that come out to the United States and, travel the country and train bartenders across the US. I think the biggest thing about Fernet-Branca is what it means when you drink Fernet. Where the vermouths and Borghetti, the liquid certainly is, the main driver of why you would probably, pour that in your cocktail. Fernet is a badge of honor that you wear, very proudly. And, I think that's the fun thing about that brand from a marketing standpoint, because, it is, you're never going to forget your first Fernet, right? That is,
That's true. I love that. Well, can you walk us through like a marketing campaign? Like let's talk about like a case study. A marketing campaign for one of the brands. What was like the playbook and what were the results?
yeah. So, I spoke earlier about, we had a total wine display for Fernet-Branca earlier this year. That was all focused around March Madness, and that was focused in California, which is their biggest market. Obviously, San Francisco kind of, put Fernet on its back. That was the first kind of display of that scale we had across a chain like that in California ever, believe it or not. And the reason that worked so well was because we had a real insight that, consumers, particularly younger consumers, right, that are watching college basketball around that particular time, right? They're getting together with friends at home to watch the games, and they're not just drinking beer, right? So this was an opportunity to build that shot and beer proposition and do it in a really fun way. What we also did was in on-premise, we have a program whereby accounts can sign up to our point of sale subscription boxes, and they can do that on the website. And we send them basically a kind of kit every season, March Madness being one of them. And they receive everything from, coasters to pendants to jerseys to all sorts of cool stuff in there, a bunch of swag. And it's our way of giving back to the bartender with some cool stuff, but equally also ensuring that we have visibility and drink specials during that time of year. And what we found in the market of California was one fed off each other. So you had a huge spike in depletions and on-premise driven by that activity, but then you also saw consumers, going into Total Wine and then actually saying, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna buy a bottle of Fernet and take it home." So I think in Nielsen that month we had a 40% increase within Total Wine in California as a result of that activity. And that sort of stuff just gives me so much confidence that we have the potential to really build this thing into something of scale. You don't have that sort of visibility every day of the week. The opportunity that we have on Fernet is really quite special. And the approach that we take with marketing, obviously, we're very localized in the way that we go to market, right? Very data led. And we're very focused on getting our marketing to the consumer at the point of consumption, right? Or the
Hmm.
point of purchase. Because, we spend, a few million on marketing. Our competitors spend a few hundred million on marketing. So our approach has to be one whereby every dollar that we spend has to count. And we need to ensure that we are driving velocity as a result of that activity. And we found a kind of algorithm to that that's been quite successful, which is applicable in a kind of rinse and repeat way, which is kind of our secret sauce to how we go out and build brands at Branca USA.
That's interesting. And I'm curious to know from the perspective of liquid to lips
Yeah,
activations. Do you find that there are certain venues or situations, like, is it just sampling at liquor stores, or are you doing like on premise like promos, or are you popping up at stadiums? Like, where do you find the engagement to be best for that type of first try driving trial moment?
sure. We do all of the above, but I think, when we're showing up at events in a really customized way, that's where consumers probably have, the most retention of the brand, right? We have these incredible Borghetti Piaggios that are bright red. A Piaggio being, it's almost like a Vespa with a bar attached to it.
Oh,
Uh,
fun.
so espresso martinis on tap, and that's as they say in marketing, an Instagrammable moment.
For sure.
So that's been very successful, I think, in introducing Borghetti to consumers in a really engaging way. And then also with Fernet-Branca, right? We show up at industry events, we show up at music events, and bring the brand to life in a really engaging way that consumers will remember. Obviously, we still do tastings in retail and all that. That's the bread and butter stuff. The stuff that actually moves the needle are those bigger activations that ultimately drive those really memorable moments for consumers that maybe haven't ever interacted with one of our brands previously.
And talking about digital channels, what's working well on social media or from a paid advertising perspective?
Well, certainly on social, we have a very active audience on social, particularly for Fernet. Consumers and bartenders who love the brand love to talk about it. So our engagement on our Instagram in particular, I think, is kind of, off the charts versus some other brands in our space. Borghetti, we're just building that now. As I mentioned, we're working with these influencers, Carlo and Sarah, who are these kind of TikTok superstars doing a great job introducing the brand to their audiences. And, that kind of UGC influencer marketing is a big part of, how we go out and build that brand with LDA and above audience. And then I think what you see with Antica Formula and Carpano in general is, there is just so many bartenders that are making videos and posting it to their channels and building their own brands. And that's just part of their bartender toolkit. So, we're not really supporting that in any way, shape, or form. It's just kind of organically happening because those are the ingredients that they would use. And that kind of means that just our brands are in the population of stuff that is out there. Some of it's driven by us, some of it has nothing to do with us, actually. But certainly, all successful or all helps in driving the success of our propositions.
Honestly, your job sounds like so much fun.
It is a very, very fun job.
Well,
And
right. And bringing all these brands, I think, to life, or reconceptualizing their position in the marketplace. It's like very much a builder mindset. So, how do you think about yourself? Do you think about yourself as a creative, an operator, or something else entirely?
good question. If I can answer it, I'd probably say I'm a creative operator in that I certainly, get a lot of enjoyment out of running a successful business, right? But really where, I am at my best is in the transformation stages, building the strategy, transforming the brands, transforming the company. And, we're still in the process of doing that here at Branca USA. The job is definitely not done, by any stretch of the imagination. Our ambition is large. We have a ton more market share to go out and grab. But I think that, the first 2 years, which were insane from a work-life balance standpoint, they were necessary for us to see the results that you spoke about at the beginning of the interview. If we hadn't done that and put the work in to try and transform, really kind of a lot of what the business was doing in the US, we wouldn't have the results that we do today. And for me, that's really where, I cut my teeth and really enjoy the kind of madness of it all. But you can't do that every single day of the week forever.
I know. You got to do the boring stuff too. So. Well, what's one piece of advice that you can share with entrepreneurs who are building brands, given your deep experience throughout your entire career?
I think one piece is certainly ensuring that, if you're an entrepreneur that has a brand, ensuring that that brand has a differentiated proposition in the marketplace. That's really important. I think if you have access to data, follow the data, use that as a way to, build your distribution in the most productive accounts. As we know, all accounts are not created equally. Don't peanut butter spread your investment. As I mentioned earlier, often what happens is, a lot of entrepreneurs, particularly if they're coming into the US for the first time, as we know, kind of look at the US as one big swimming pool, and you drown pretty quick, typically. And I think, as most folks have probably said in your show, be consistent and also be patient. It takes time to build successful brands. Branca's been around for 180 years, and we're just figuring it out in the US now. You think about a brand like Tito's, they didn't become Tito's overnight. It took, a lot of many years of door-to-door sales to make that brand into what it is. So patience, I think, is something that is critical. And, most entrepreneurs, I think, know that. But in the drinks industry, based on the 3-tier system and all of that, you just need to give yourself a little bit more grace and a little bit more patience to break through.
Right. Definitely a longer runway than I think a lot of people might expect just hopping into the industry. So, from a business perspective, what's keeping you up at night these days?
Well, I try to get a good night's sleep most nights. I find that tends to be relatively conducive to problem solving the next day. I think at the moment, definitely, the climate is very uncertain, as it relates to trade between the US and the EU. Obviously, we're fully exposed to that as a business. And then I think also, there's a lot of changes happening within the distributor tier that have implications as well, right? Just to route to market access. But look, at the end of the day, everything normally works out pretty well. And those are macro situations that, quite frankly, there's little that we can do to influence them. I think for me, I always try and have a plan B. And if plan B doesn't work, then, at least have the beginnings of a plan C. And that's typically, where I spend a lot of my time right now, trying to think through all the eventual possibilities and ensuring that we're prepared for whatever comes up.
Yeah. Just on that note, I am curious to know, when you're thinking about, okay, I need to make a plan B and potentially a plan C, do you actually carve out time on your schedule of like, this is a block of strategy, or I'm going to spend 3 days like on strategy this month? Or how do you think about making the brain space for that?
Every day from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. So I have that blocked out on my calendar. I typically try and not take calls during that period of time. And I'm typically bothering other people in the office because, I'm trying to, get a little, brain group together to tackle those things. But yes, absolutely. And, that was something that I learned from an executive coach a few years ago. And I wouldn't change that because it really does help. And look, it could be 9 to 11, it could be, 3 to 5, whatever it might be. But I try and take 90 minutes to 2 hours every single day to just try and review some of the work that the strategy team have done and, give them counsel so that we can ensure that, plan C is ready by the time that, plan B doesn't work. So, that is just something, particularly in the last year, knowing that, there was going to be, a number of potential trade issues. That's something that we've really tried to carve space out on the agenda, for the executive team and the strategy team to ensure that we're not caught off guard.
Well, great advice. I think I will take you up on that. So how do you see the beverage, industry, like Bev Alc, evolving over the next couple of years? We're seeing a lot of shifts here and there. Some people say we're seeing cyclical changes. Other people say, it's structural, it's temporary, it's long term. What are your thoughts on the shifts that we're seeing in the industry, and how do you see things playing out?
Well, we actually mapped the industry over the last 50 years, as far as we could go back from the data that we had available. And, what's true of this industry is that it is cyclical, to your point. And, there's, peaks and there's lows. Obviously, we're in a down period at the moment. And, there's a lot of noise, right, in the, annual reports and a lot of the Wall Street analysis about what's driving that. But the reality of it is, I think the industry will bounce back, and I think that those that are patient and those that invest for the future are going to be the companies and the brands that come out on top, and that's really what we are very focused on at Branca USA.
Yeah. And to that point, what's your long term vision for Branca USA? Where do you see this portfolio 5, 10 years from now?
Yeah. Well, look, I think our kind of vision, our mission, whatever you want to call it, is to really create the next generation of power brands in bitters, in cocktail modifiers, and vermouth. We're a non-traditional supplier. We don't have whiskey, tequila, vodka, etc. Right? We're very focused on what we know best. But when you look at those categories, Jägermeister, that was a brand that Zenith was 3 million cases, right? It's 1 million cases today, and it still owns 70% share of the bitters category. Similarly, Kahlua, which isn't a brand that we probably talk about a lot, still has 80% share of coffee liqueur. So, we see a long roadmap to taking share from those legacy brands and quote unquote disrupting the status quo, and that's very exciting, right? Because that's challenger brand thinking, and gives you a kind of clear you know, uh, brand to focus on to go out and grab share. So I think we will continue to do that for sure. We also have a number of brands in development. So we've redeveloped Borghetti. We have a couple of others within the portfolio that we're looking at. So, there'll be more relaunches to come. And I think that, 5 years from now, Branca USA will be a business that, is in the mix. We're certainly not going to be, a 20 million case business. I think that that's probably unrealistic unless we buy something. But ultimately, we will continue to be a business that grows its market share and is, more widely available across every single state in the country.
All right. So, last question. We always like to pay it forward and inspire our listenership to, be thinking about what's next. So, let's say that a drinks entrepreneur asks you for a book, online class, industry group, person to follow. Who or what do you recommend to provide insights?
Well, let me give you one book which I was introduced to very early on in my career, and I've kind of used it as a bit of a mantra, particularly in the transformation stages of this business. It's a book called A Beautiful Constraint by a British guy, Adam Morgan, and it really focuses on brands and businesses that look at their constraints or limitations, and instead of seeing them as such, they see them as a catalyst to drive breakthrough thinking that drives transformative growth. That is an incredible quick read, which I think any entrepreneur in any industry would get a ton of value from. In terms of people to follow, I mean, one of the folks that I look up to is A.G. Lafley, the guy that ran P&G so successfully for so many years, and he's written a lot of great strategy and leadership books, and does a lot of TED Talk stuff and everything else you can find on YouTube. But he said something which really stuck with me. I think in the first all hands meeting I had with my leadership team when I came to Branca, I probably used this quote, but it was something along the lines of, You want to compete like hell externally, but collaborate like family internally. And that works great for a commercial organization because it kind of changes the mindset, right? You're not focused on competing with each other. You're really focused on taking share from the competition. And I think that that's also a pretty useful, slogan to have on the t-shirt for entrepreneurs trying to make their way into the competitive market that is the U.S. wine and spirits industry.
Yeah. Well, Chris, this has been such an insightful conversation. I have learned a lot, and I think our listeners will too. So thank you so much for coming on The Business of Drinks.
Thank you, Erica. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Welcome back to Last Call. It is Caroline Lamb again with Erica and Scott. So I'm thinking back to the early days of this show when we were exploring some THC brands, thinking that low dose would be the future of the category. But according to Brian Roth's excellent reporting in Sightlines, titled One and Done, more THC drinkers are choosing 10 milligram and up as preferred drink potency, published on April 14th. He writes that nearly 60% of hemp-derived THC drinkers are now reaching for 10 milligram beverages. This is the legal limit in many states, and that's an 18% jump in just 2 years. Meanwhile, those lower dose drinks that are 2 to 5 milligrams are losing steam, almost down 9%. If you're in Minnesota, though, where hemp drinks are booming, 90% of THC drink sales are 10 milligrams. So it seems like we're kind of going down the path of the more bang for your buck. And I want to hear what you guys are thinking about the psychology of value in the THC drink space, and kind of the erosion of the middle ground here.
Yeah, this speaks to me really of some maturation in the marketplace. So early on, we had a lot of these hemp THC sales going through direct to consumer channels, digital channels. And people were experimenting, the products were doing well there. And I think that's where we saw tons and tons of these 2 to 5 milligram dosage products, right? Like these lower dose hemp derived THC products. So I consider that like an experimental phase. And I do still think we're in an experimental phase, but that we're shifting channels, right? So now more states are allowing these products to be sold in wine and liquor stores and even grocery stores and in bars and restaurants. And I think, to my thinking, that in these bricks and mortar locations, people are looking for more bang for their buck. Similar reasons that someone might reach for a cocktail as opposed to a low alc beer, right? So the retailers that I've talked with, just anecdotally, they've confirmed what we see in Brian's reporting, which is that higher dosages are selling better. So, in a lot of states, the top dosage you can sell for hemp-derived THC drinks is 10 milligrams. And I think that's where we're starting to see the experimentation and that bang for your buck sort of buying happen. And I will add that I had my first sighting this week of THC drinks sold in a bar in New Jersey. And the offerings were a can of Wink, which was 5 milligrams, or you could add 1 or 2 shots of Nowadays to a drink. So it would be a 5 milligram or a 10 milligram dose. So I think like this is like kind of it feels to me like an evolution. Like we had the DTC channel, people were trying out lower dosage. Now we're seeing the bricks and mortar where I do feel like at least from what I've heard from retailers, those higher dosages are selling better. And where do we go from here? I don't know. Maybe Scott has ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I just caution that we know a little bit about sales data, but we know so little about consumption data and habits and behavior, right? I think it would be problematic to assume that when people are consuming these, they are going to be consuming them in the exact same way as an analog for an alcoholic beverage, right? We know that if we're going out for an evening, I might have 2 or 3 beers. The assumption, therefore, would be that if I'm going out, I might have 2 or 3 THC drinks, whereas that's probably not the case. I think what we're beginning to see is maybe I'll nurse my THC drink that is 5 or 10 milligrams, and I'll have one of those. Herein lies potential opportunity, right, to play around with pricing, knowing this type of thing, but knowing that folks are also probably maybe having one THC drink with soda or a complete non-alc option that doesn't contain THC. So it's very, very early days. I look forward to seeing what we can learn while there are some studies around behavior and consumption. And it's a really, really exciting time to be observing the kind of infancy of this data and witness it.
Yeah, I agree. And what you were saying makes me think about people who probably are not trading one for the other, maybe having both. And before the next episode, I'm going to try to come up with a term like zebra striping, but for THC and alcohol, maybe like unicorn striping. Anyway, thank you for joining us on the Business of Drinks. Please follow us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, and tap the notification button so you'll be the first to know when a new episode is released. Rate us with our star ratings, and please share us on social if you feel compelled. Finally, if there's anything you'd like us to cover on the podcast, let us know in our messages on Instagram, LinkedIn, or in our email podcast@businessofdrinks.com. We'll talk soon.